So I'm just going to touch on Dash, and then maybe Mallory, I might pass it over to you if that's okay, to sort of explain Dash in terms of how it's used in the in simulation at the moment. So Dash is, we've talked about a little bit about setting objectives, running a scenario, debriefing. Dash, which stands for Debriefing Assessment for Simulation in Healthcare, is really about assessing you as a debriefer. So, you know, we, in the time of COVID, we're here on Zoom, trying to give folks some skills about how to debrief. In real life, we might, if we're running live scenarios, maybe Mallory is sitting with one of you, and you are debriefing a scenario, and then Mallory is going to provide some feedback to you on your debriefing. So this is about assessing you as a debriefer. So there's some, you can get this resource at the Harvard Sim website. And then there is a number of different checklists and metrics that you can use. But it really looks at several elements. Does the debriefer establish an engaging learning environment? Do they maintain that environment? Are you structured in an organized way? Are you providing engaging discussion? How do you explain those performance gaps? And do you help those achieve or sustain good future performance? So this is, as you are evolving in your role as debriefer, a way that you can be assessed by a peer to get some helpful feedback on your own debriefing skills. Mallory, do you want to talk a little bit more about how that's being used in at the Waterloo campus?
Yeah, so again, pre-COVID, when we were running scenarios with our undergrads, what we tried to do was to have 2 facilitators if possible, which I think just adds to the whole scenario at the end of the day as well, but also so that we could do this piece, because again, most of our facilitators are quite are often junior and don't have a ton of experience, and so it's very helpful for debriefing to be able to talk about it afterwards and talk about how it went, what you did well, and what we can improve on. It also makes you eligible for a Section 3 Royal College credits. So those are the self-assessment credits, and so if you actually debrief the debrief, that can qualify. So it's kind of another incentive for facilitators to get those credits.
In the same way that we give participants feedback, I think the Dash is helpful to structure the feedback that you're receiving from colleagues. Because, Ali made a good point, right? You could be expert at using the AIs and the focused facilitation techniques, but then still struggle to sort of string things together. So I did find that this tool is helpful because it captures sort of the real main elements of making a debrief successful. And that's in how do you actually flow the conversation from time period to time period. And in our group, we talked about some strategies around that, in terms of using like a narrative approach of like this happened and this happened and this happened, and sort of sampling different time points versus more of like an objective organization. So we're going to talk about CRM type A, where we're going to talk about closed loop communication, and then we're going to talk about role clarity, and then we're going to talk about medical objectives. So your organization and your structure are also captured in here. And then the main points, if you look at it, like 4 and 5 really capture that ability to pull out the performance gaps of the participants, which is really the meat of debriefing. So I think this tool is a effective way for you to get better at the process, and also giving others feedback using the Dash tool helps you practice your facilitation. So it's almost like you're debriefing inside the debriefing. So you get to debrief twice in one sim. So it maximizes your ability to improve in a single session. I think we were going to go through some tips as well, unless there were any questions on the Dash framework. Dave, did you want to take us through some of the tips we had for some experiences that you've had in debriefing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I missed the last part. Who is going to be doing the Dash? So is it an external observer then doing the Dash framework?
So it would be actually 2. So typically we try and have 2 facilitators at each sim session for learners. And so afterwards, the 2 facilitators would kind of debrief each other, so evaluate each other, so you could both learn. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, you circle your scores at the same time and then reveal. Any other questions on the Dash framework? No? Okay, great. Dave, let's go through some tips.
And I think that, one of the benefits and challenges of having small breakout groups is You probably talked about some of these in your breakout groups and maybe some other things as well. Some tips or final closing comments that Aleem and I wanted to make were, asking open-ended questions and using silence often allow to draw out those learners a bit more in terms of getting their perspective, getting people engaged, being a bit uncomfortable with silence. Setting an agenda and limiting objectives. We talked about this at the beginning, but I find for myself, in terms of how to actually navigate a debrief in the time allotted, it's helpful if I know that I want to talk about 2 or 3 things, so that I can move a conversation along. Otherwise, I find we go down strange paths that may or may not be fruitful. And so having that agenda and limiting the objective to, usually it's 3 points or something like that, is usually an efficient way to keep things online and sharing that model with people. Expert groups, of course, when we're doing interdisciplinary in situ sim, for example, really a facilitator's role is to steer the conversation or to have some framework, but those groups are very good at debriefing themselves. And learners may be as well, but they just might need some more facilitation. And circular questions, I think, is yours, Aleem. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so I think one thing I kind of touched on earlier was this guess what I'm thinking style of question. So questions that only sort of lead to one response. So it's kind of similar to open-ended questions, but also questions where you have left your frame implicit and not made it explicit. And so you create a power dynamic between yourself and the participants to say that I have a piece of knowledge, I have a judgment that I'm ascribing to an event, but I'm not going to share that with you. And so the way this happens is if you ask a question with a label attached to it. So you say I noticed that Newman, you seemed quite angry, right? Or something like that. Or you say something where you're like, it seemed quite dangerous, but you don't give an explanation for why. Also situations where you're asking for a very specific response. So you're asking for the learner to come up with a single answer. So sometimes we do this when we're talking to learners and we say, name, 2 causes of shock. Well, there's 4. So why not just ask the question why don't you describe to me a couple of different types of shock and what do you know about it? And you can get a better sense of what the learner knows. And so circular questions are too narrow, and create a power hierarchy between the 2 of you. And so I think avoiding them where possible. The way I do that is anytime I ask a question, I always take a step back and say, is there more than one possible response for this? And is the response for this more than one word, right? For those of you who have young kids and, they come home from school and you're like, how did your day go? And they're like, good. And you're like, well, that was not as open as I thought, right? So you want to try and ask these questions that really pull your learners out, because as much as possible, you want your participants speaking during a debriefing session. And sometimes that means being comfortable with the silence in between responses, or allowing them to set the agenda and navigate through it a little bit more than you feel comfortable with initially, and over time being able to pull in different elements from your own experiences. Any questions about any of those tips that we kind of went over? Or I know we have quite a few experts in the group as well here who have some facilitating experience. Are there any other tips that you wanted to share with your colleagues or wanted to bring attention to the group?
I struggle with when it's interdisciplinary, having the right kind of, as a physician, when I'm debriefing, how do you find those learning objectives for your nurses and stuff? Do you always have a nurse facilitator? Because I think when you and I did Sim Aleem a couple of weeks ago, I think I lost some of the nurses during our discussion because maybe it wasn't relevant for their learning objective.
Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and great point. My habit in the past, when I was in Thunder Bay and running interdisciplinary sim, was to try to have whoever the target groups were, to have that team as group of facilitators. So if it's a doc and a nurse and RT, then to have a doc and a nurse and an RT as facilitators. If that's not possible, then I think there's really good value in understanding at the outset before the debrief begins what the objectives of all those different stakeholders are. Because I think you bring up a great point that your frame and your perspective as an MD is going to be different than the nursing perspective or an RT or a resident perspective or whatever. So if we aren't able to have that team of facilitators, then I think that being able to understand the objectives at the outset and respect and engage with those objectives is key. So I'm not going to know what the nursing answers are, but I can ask the questions.
I think that the other point that comes up here is limiting objectives. And what I've often seen in those scenarios where it's intended to be interdisciplinary simulation, to Dave's point, it wasn't always conceived as an interdisciplinary scenario. And so that's step one that was done incorrectly, right? You have to involve those participants from the outset in creating it so that it reflects their needs and their learning objectives. The next point is that in the debrief, sometimes we default to what we're most comfortable with. And that's our area of medical expertise, whatever specialty, whatever discipline we are. And so one of the challenges in the debrief is to uncouple the medical objectives that we're more comfortable talking about and to extrapolate more of the principles that are universally applicable, like CRM principles, like leadership, communication, role clarity, all of those kind of things. And so it does necessarily sometimes mean cutting off conversations that can get too detailed. And so, Ali, to your point, we've had sims where we have, 3 or 4 emerge docs, because you have the residents, the med students, and, then the staff, and then you have 2 or 3 nurses. And they end up dominating the discussion with something about like, have you guys read the latest trial on apneic oxygenation? And they kind of go down this whole rabbit hole, and it's like 20 minutes later, and the nurses in the group and the RT in the group are like, how is this relevant to me? So I think as a facilitator, it's also being aware of what the demographics of your group are, being aware of what the initial a priori objectives were, and then being okay with tabling certain objectives and bringing them up at a later point. And so when I debrief, when we're talking about the structure of your analysis phase, I'll debrief with an objective-based approach, but I'll always start with our CRM or communication-based principles first, because it allows us to have a rich discussion that everyone can participate in. And then when we get down to medical objectives that might be more specific per group, let's say we're going to talk about, we got new pumps in Joe Branch just before COVID, and the nurses want to practice, the infusions on it. And that's one of the objectives of this scenario. And that's why we have a massive transfusion protocol. Then we'll break into small groups and have our nursing educator go with the nurses and talk about the pump in specific. And we'll break off with the docs and talk about the new protocol that's been implemented at the hospital and what are some of the nuances for the group. And so you can actually physically separate the groups at that point and then bring you back together for the takeaways as well. So strategies would be to know what the objective is beforehand, be aware of the discussion as you're going and not be afraid to curtail it, and then separate where needed, and also have an interdisciplinary team at the outset.
Aline, do you actually state your objectives to the group during the debrief, or you're the only person as a facilitator who knows the objective and you're kind of leading the group without revealing it? And what would be the benefits to one or the other?
Yeah, Irene, I think that's a really good point. I think it depends on how important the objectives are and what the purpose of the simulation was. So if the simulation was for example, a group of residents, it's important for them to know the objectives because those objectives often reflect something that they're going to be evaluated on in the future, right? So if today, for example, with the residents, we did a simulation on protected intubations, right? So they need to know that they are doing a protected intubation. The goal is protected intubation. They should know the algorithm because it's going to appear in real life and on their exam. So being explicit with the objectives with that group is important because it has downstream implications. For our in situ interdisciplinary simulations, our objectives are often more structured around CRM principles and less on medical knowledge. And so it's less important for me to be explicit about the fact that, you should know that in anaphylaxis you should give epinephrine, because most of the time those objectives are already hit and touched upon. So less important for me to be explicit. Sometimes also the medical objective, when we're setting our agenda for the debrief, I might say, okay, I want to talk about closed loop communication, and I want to talk about epinephrine for anaphylaxis, and I want to talk about, the role of steroids. Let's say those are my 3 objectives. And when the participants start debriefing, they start talking about role clarity and latent safety threats, and I see that there's actually a conflict between the two. I might actually discount some of the objectives that I had intended to debrief upon because the richness is actually in a different area. And so that question's response depends on the group with whom you're doing the simulation and your original sort of a priori purpose and location for doing it, if that makes sense. Dave, do you have other thoughts on that?
No, I agree. When I bring them up, Irene, it's often in that moment where I really like to ask this question: did anything come up in the scenario that you want to make sure that we talk about? And so I get their feedback on what those moments are, and then I might share what my objectives are coupled with theirs. I might say, I have the same objectives as you. Let's also talk about situational awareness in this context or whatever. And so I like getting their feedback first and understanding how my objectives interface with theirs.
Yeah, and you might discover that there's so many objectives to discover, and then there might need to be a shared decision making of, oh wow, we have like 10 things to talk about. Let's as a group decide what are the top 3 we can talk about, just in the interest of this debrief not being like 4 hours.
I sometimes find you can tell at the beginning when you have a mixed group. Like we get mixed groups all the time at the Michener, and it some people who are new, maybe more junior learners, doing ACLS for the first time, for example, they don't see the importance of themselves as team leader, and they don't feel they need to know all this stuff. And so I try to point out to them who finds the patient on the ward. I try to make it situational to them. Like, is it going to be the doctor or the RT that finds the patient in respiratory distress? No, it's going to be the nurse. So who's going to be the team leader to start with? The nurse that finds the patient. I find if I do that in the like I established what their professions all are at the very beginning, and I try and make it relevant before we even start, and it tends to increase their interest a bit. And I point out, okay, it's July 1st and your code team comes up and you're the the R1 shows up and you're a nurse with 20 years experience and they ask you to give the wrong drug dose. If you know what the drug doses are, no, you can't prescribe them, but you can sure point out to the resident doctor, are you sure that that's what you want to give?
Yeah.
And I find that helps a little bit. And yes, they have different objectives, but in that scenario, I think emphasizing the importance of their role in the beginning as a member of the team seems to help. And it's taken a few people that are like, I'm only here because my employer said I have to be. It can sometimes help that scenario a bit and make it a more productive group for everybody.
Those are really good points, Martha, about really getting people to, first of all, engage in simulation, right? Because you kind of address the person who's there by force, right? The one who was told to kind of show up to your simulation and is now here. And those who are reluctant to take on either leadership or team member roles. I think there's also a shifting perspective on the role of the team leader as well. And I think there's a better understanding now that the team leader is not responsible for every piece of it. That as a team, we work together, and the team leader's job is to filter out different pieces of information, to set a clear direction for the team, and then unify the direction so that everyone is working in the same area. And so I think those are really good points and some good suggestions of how we can engage participants, make sure that they feel vested. I know it's similarly when we have emerge sort of simulations and we have off-service residents who come through and they're kind of like, oh, well, I'm never going to see a sick patient. And you're like, really? You're never going to have a sick patient in your office, or you're not going to be an off-service resident where you're the only one on overnight. I think some of the principles are universal, and some of the communication elements that you take away from simulation we were talking about in our group are actually valuable even beyond simulation. They can be so helpful for interpersonal conflict or even communication in other areas of healthcare as well. So some really good points.
Yeah, next time I have a difficult patient, I'm going to try Advocacy Inquiry.
Oh yeah, I love it for my difficult patients. Like the sim stuff is great. Yeah. You seem upset at the wait time.
I notice you're not taking your meds as prescribed. And now your blood pressure is through the roof. What do you think about that? Okay. So I think that's all the prepared material we have for this afternoon. I would like to be as good as Aleem at tolerating a little bit of silence. I'm just not the greatest at that. So I would like to be able to give people a minute to think of any kind of questions they might have before we close for the afternoon.
As long as there's open space, I'd like to ask a question about the simulation I'm doing tomorrow.
Sure.
Shoot.
So I'm doing a telehealth simulation where I won't actually be able to watch all of the students while they are doing it, but I'm still planning on doing a group debrief with all of them. Do you have any particular points when you didn't actually get to watch their behavior?
Do you want to explain your context a little bit, Michael?
So my PA students are going to be doing a telehealth visit over Zoom with a standardized patient. But I am the one running it, and there are 5 rooms going on at the same time. So I will not be able to observe all of them as they're doing it, but I will still be holding a debrief session with all of them after all of them are finished. So I do still have 2 or 3 objectives to go over with them to get them to talk about, but I won't actually get to observe their behavior, so I can't specifically give them any feedback. But I would kind of like them still to talk through what their feelings were in going through the situation, especially because this is the first time we've done this type of simulation.
Hi, Michael. Dave here. Will the standardized patients be able to give any feedback?
Yes, I will get feedback from the standardized patients after the students have finished.
What I would say is, wow, that sounds super challenging. And good for you for doing it. Yeah, I'm not sure that I have anything brilliant to say, other than I think as much feedback as you can get from those standardized patients, which is specific, will probably be helpful, for you to be able to facilitate more. And then I think it's really about leading a facilitated, self-reflection from those, PA students, right? Because if you can't see them, then it's really about what their perspective was. I might try to, if I were in your situation and you know what the scenario is, just be clear about what your objectives are, and if there was a couple of moments or key highlights, instead of having generalities, for them to say, oh, I think it went generally well and I had a connection with the patient, be able to say, this specific moment, tell me what you did in that specific moment. Was that the right thing to do? Was it not? And I think that if you're not being able to see it, to be able to get them to self-reflect on specific moments might be more helpful in terms of generating some benefit for them.
I don't know if Aaron, you have some thoughts you want to add to that from the SP perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, the SPs can be helpful in helping you find those specifics, but I think if it's going to be sort of a group debrief, I really like David's thought of it more being a facilitated self-debrief almost, especially if you have 1 or 2 students who feel comfortable sharing maybe their experiences as sort of like exemplars, to be like, if anyone else had a similar type of experience, let's kind of look at that, or how would you have felt if this was your experience? Yeah, it's definitely challenging, but I think you can still hit a lot of those objectives by doing it in a group style. It may not be as personal for each individual person, but I imagine, especially if it's your first time doing it and it's their first time, there might be a bit of overlap in terms of experience for your students. And so it might be helpful to find 1 or 2 key things. Even if you pop into 1 or 2 and see like 2 things happen that are similar, and using those as something to jump off of.
Yeah, I'm almost afraid to pop in because I don't want to ruin their rhythm, when they're just one-on-one with the SP. I know when I pop into their breakout rooms when they're having discussions, the talking seems to stop, immediately turns to asking me questions about what they think they should be doing. But I get your point. Is there an
opportunity to record and view the files before you debrief? Because I would say I'd probably use video technology in that case, if possible, to stagger, even if you create like a short break. So you have these visits in the morning and then you have a chance to review the video. And then afterwards, if it's possible to schedule like that, I think it would allow you to be more specific to David's point.
Yeah, I did set up about 3 hours in between the end of the sessions and the debrief.
So that's, I would then just record each interaction and then either watch it or farm that out to some helpers who can help you watch. And even if you just skim through, I would say I would use the litmus testing, right? So just the random sampling, like instead of watching all 10 minutes, watch like, and you can kind of think of, if you created the scenario or you're familiar with the scenario, you can think of like what the trigger point is going to be for a reaction from the participant, right? Because every simulation has like 3 or 4 states when you're creating it, right? And so you can think about, of the 4 states that you've created, usually the first one is like the starting state and the 4th one is like the resolution. And somewhere in between 2 and 3 is usually the 10 point, right? Like the climax of your simulation, if you think about it like a movie. If you sample the 2 minutes around where that interaction should be, whether it's a conflict because it's a difficult patient or it's a high stress scenario like intubation and there's a technical component, if you just sample like the 2 minutes around there, you'll probably get enough points that could be specific enough to each individual where you could say, hey, Joe, I noticed you did this, and Sally did this, and, Shu did this. And so I noticed these 3 different moments of time. There were similar experiences. Let's discuss that as a group. I think that would probably be my strategy at that point, so that you don't have to watch every single interview all the way through if it's just you, because just from a time perspective, you may not have enough.
Yeah, no, it would take me 8 hours.
Yeah.
Or if there's even an opportunity to debrief with the SPs in a large group, and just kind of getting them together, it's a little bit of a safer space because the students won't be there to ask them their thoughts and see if they're picked up on any themes in their scenarios.
Yeah, I did schedule 30 minutes with the SPs at the end, so hopefully they can give me some feedback.
And the video also allows you to, if the students know it beforehand that their performance will be recorded and utilized for the debriefing, what you can actually do then is actually show moments of each clip, either to each student individually or depending on sort of what your setup is, you can actually choose moments to showcase to the whole group to say, hey, look, this is an example where, this guy did a really good job. I want to show you the elements that they used here. And then I'm going to go to another one and show you this and see, okay, so at this point I'm noticing there's some conflict. Let's unpack that as a group. And so you can actually make everyone else watch each other and then debrief them as a group. That's another strategy you could use.
If I can again tack on a little bit on Liam on what you said about, those trigger points or those main themes, if you fill your SPs in on that as well too, maybe it's something while they're in the scenario they can wait for or pick out. I know with my SPs, that's often something I'll do is like, hey, this is something that's going to make them angry or make them whatever. And then kind of use that as a polling method of like, when I get my SPs all together in a group afterwards to be like, so how many of you did that actually happen for?
So it's 4:20. So we're going to bring this workshop to a close. I would like to say thank you to everyone who's facilitated and participated, and thank you to Jen Tran for managing the software through our workshop. Yes, everyone's clapping. I know nobody can hear anybody. So thank you very much. There you go. There's the icon there from Johnny.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your participation.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for coming.